That's probably the most difficult thing about somebody going through the creative process is if they're only met with success. I know that's weird. It's like, oh, but life's so easy. What's wrong with just succeeding again and again and again? If all you do is succeed, you're not learning anything. Almost by definition, you're just getting lucky.
Jacob Hester-Heard, welcome back to the show.
Nigel, thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Again.
Repeat guest.
Yeah. I guess I did something right.
Yeah,
third time. Yeah,
back.
gosh, you're right. Yeah. Awesome.
One virtual, one in person.
Yeah.
And that was great. That was not chaotic at all. And then
not at all. Yeah. Glad to be back.
So today I want to talk about creativity, amongst other things. And to start off, do you think that creativity is limited to the arts and the humanities?
Short answer, no. Right? I think there's a lot of domains in which creativity, the creative spirit can express itself. I think humans are innately creative. Really, I think creativity is what sets us apart from, let's say, most of creation, creatures. They are created and we are creators, right? I mean, just that's almost what made us people, right? If you look at the archaeological record, we're like, dude, thumbs? Heck yeah. And we could start molding our world around us. And that was a huge step. And that's, I think, innately human. So, the arts maybe are the ultimate expression of creativity. They are creativity for creativity's sake, which is special, and that's awesome. But I would say almost every human endeavor is an act of creativity at its core.
So I was going to ask you something else, but after you said that, what do you think of like elephants that paint?
I can't go into the mind of an elephant. I would love for somebody to make that possible, create that possibility. My gut instinct, and I could be wrong. Right, my gut instinct is that that maybe it's 5% creativity and 95% training, right? And we can haggle on the price. Is it 10%, 90? Is it 50-50? I don't think it's even close to 50-50 or 60-40. I think it's mostly training, and that's a good question. Maybe there is a spark of creativity within. A spark of potential, right, within everything and everybody, right? We came out of the primordial ooze, right? So that question could be equally applied to humanity 20, 30,000 years ago, right? Our proto-ancestors. There's no way that Australopithecus could create a civilization, right? If it was an alien outsider looking in, they'd probably come to a similar conclusion. And of course we did that. So an elephant as it is right now, I'd say 90% training, 10% creativity, right? Max. But I do sincerely think that there are quite a few species which exhibit important characteristics for what we would consider general intelligence, sentience, human levels of creativity. And I do acknowledge that, and I think at some point it's the ultimate responsibility of a creative species to like shepherd that possibility into fruition if it's ever going to happen. But that might be a different conversation.
Yeah, not exactly what we plan to talk about, but I just felt like throwing it in there.
For sure.
So going back to what you had mentioned earlier about creativity being a part of most, if not all, human endeavors. If people are knowingly or unknowingly involving their creative process in their work, your creative process is intimately tied to yourself, right? How do you think people can go about increasing their confidence in their own creative process, whether that be something like art or something more less entrepreneurial, that isn't, always directly associated with creativity.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's something completely mundane, like sales, right? That's an incredibly creative enterprise. I did sales for like 5 years before I entered my current career, and if you weren't creative, you did not succeed. And that was maybe the hardest part, was having confidence in your ability to create value out of sometimes literally nothing, right? Because you're told to sell what you're told to sell. And if you believe in the product, that's great. But anybody in sales would probably agree with me. You don't always believe in the product. That is where a lot of creativity comes in. So from the entire spectrum, right, whether you're building something tangible and physical in, let's say, reality, or whether you're building something that's more intrinsic to, it's more conceptual than anything. Right, like even in education, an educator is building something in a future generation. That's an act of creation, right? But as far as any of those paradigms having a building of confidence in those environments, maybe not the answer, but the best starting place that I would suggest for any of them is to just do it. Just go out there and do the thing. I think a lot of people are scared of getting out there and failing. And I think we've discussed this before, either on a podcast or just between you and me, that kind of the greatest ability you can cultivate in yourself is the ability to fail iteratively, to fail quickly, fail as safely as you can, and then pivot and go towards the next endeavor, whether you win or lose. Because eventually, law of big numbers, you're going to succeed, and you will learn every failure along the way what to do better the next time. And I don't think that process leads to anything but confidence if you see it through.
So while you were describing that, another avenue of, or another example of creativity I was thinking of is like doing math problems. It's something that isn't obviously creative, right? You always get the right answer. There's one answer to get, right? But when you ask someone how they do math in their head, it can be very different from person to person. And I think that is kind of an example of creativity. But as you mentioned before, it's kind of it's easier in a field like mathematics to build confidence, right? Because you're going to do it, and you're either going to get the wrong answer or the right answer. And the more often you get the right answer, it's easier to, feel that you are fulfilling whatever purpose is there to fulfill. But with the idea of creation for the sake of creation, or something that is more along those lines, the metric of success is also part of the creativity. Like it's how does that fit into, what you're saying about building confidence?
Yeah, I mean, the mathematician, right? I would agree hesitantly to say that it's easier, but for the reasons that you just called out, that their actions are very quantifiable. In most cases, there's some fringe mathematics, right? Especially bleeding edge stuff where we actually don't know the answer yet, and it's still theory, and that's super cool. But compared to a social science or something where the experiment is ongoing and it's on the order of decades, it is, quote, easier in that sense because the outcomes are kind of quantifiable, verifiable, the associated risk level is comparatively low, and I think that's what makes it more difficult. Those are the two kind of things that make certain endeavors more difficult. Is the risk higher in some way? And there are plenty of ways to quantify risk, and is your end state even quantifiable? Because sometimes it's kind of not. It's a pretty qualitative outcome, and anyone who's had to write a promotion packet to their boss to say this is why you should pay me more money for what I do, and struggles to find the quantitative aspects behind what they do because it's a very qualitative position that brings a ton of value to society, it's a difficult position to be in, and so that act of creativity is similarly difficult in many regards.
So, still working on that like metric of success, because you mention like it providing value to society in some way, right? So I'm curious if for example, the Beatles, a widely accepted, successful band, good band, if they, hadn't blown up, if they hadn't been widespread phenoms across the entire world, would you still consider them successful? Is it based on the product that they made, whether or not it's appreciated by other people, or is it related to its widespread impact? Or do you think that's maybe up to the artist?
Yeah. Wow. Great question. In this universe where they did blow up, it's really easy to say, like, yeah, of course they would still be successes. Their music was great. But I think it's important to identify that's a very subjective opinion that you would have, right? The Monkees, similar era, similar genre. I confused a lot of their songs with the Beatles when I was younger. Still might do that every now and then. But they didn't blow up during the British invasion like the Beatles did. And I would think they're not being a household name, especially with today's generation compared to the Beatles, who maybe people even this generation haven't even heard any of their music. That's I think that's telling that the Monkees, for example, are a litmus test of the answer to your question. So objectively, no, but I also caveat that by saying, what do you mean by objectively? Because the standard by which we measure success is, by definition, constrained in very specific, measurable parameters. So when you say, yeah, but take all of those parameters away, then you're just left with the answer of like, well, no, by definition, they wouldn't have been considered successful. So, no.
Yeah.
But, hey, we live in the universe where they took our culture by storm. So it kind of speaks for itself, right?
So do you think that, from the perspective of the artist or the entrepreneur or the mathematician or whatever, do you think that those metrics should or should not be important when trying to, build their own confidence in their own creative process or outcome?
It kind of depends. I yes and no. I think the answer to that dilemma is, as much as possible, the artist should focus on the art, right? And at the same time, if I were counseling a friend in this particular question, I would say you should get a business manager, because there's nothing more draining on a creative work than having to pay taxes or balance your accounts at the end of a fiscal year. At the same time, not is it just a drain on the creative process, there are super important opportunities that you might miss if all your focus is on the art, right? Huge common phenomena I think that we've all heard of, at least conceptually, with, a rock band or whatever, accusing one of their members of selling out or wanting to sell out. What does that mean? We all, as the fans, want the band to focus on the art, right? That's why we fell in love with them at the first place. But would you have ever heard of them if there had been zero business deals in the first place? Somebody behind the scenes working a thankless job that's very important to society made the Beatles cross the Atlantic. And if it wasn't for them, there's a very real chance that they never would have blown up in our culture the way they did. They wouldn't have gone on the late night talk shows that they did, and we might not have ever heard of them. And that was a business guy, right? Is the art important? Absolutely. Is the business important? Yeah, that's the way the world works right now. And I would argue that's the way it should work, right? Meritocracy, or at least as close as we can approximate it, while not getting in the way of the art itself. So yeah, I think it's both.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, like everything has hints of art in it, right? And that business decision to go over is it's a creative decision in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
And it's
and
not
risky.
Yeah, and it's not a musically creative thing, which is what the band is known for, right? But that doesn't mean that, in its own right, that is its own, risk and process, and had its own outcome. I'm curious about. There's a pretty common, I guess, trope, with artists of all different kinds, or entrepreneurs, between substance use and creativity, right? Like, like Wolf on Wall Street, for example, right? Obviously, they're doing all kinds of stuff, but
yes,
the Beatles fit into this camp easily. I think Ernest Hemingway said, write drunk, edit sober, right?
Yes.
So what do you think about the? Do you think it's a legitimate dependence on any given substance to facilitate that creativity, or do you think it's a lack of confidence in what they could produce, sober-minded?
I was talking about this last night with a very close friend. This exact topic, exactly the same framing and examples that you used. I think I invoked Jimi Hendrix as an example, right? I think it's, like a lot of things, it's more complicated than just, is it A or is it B? But I will start by saying I think primarily it's actually C. Not neither of those things. Although both play a role, so I'm not discounting them entirely. I think primarily many geniuses, because so often those are the people who are making it to the top of the top of the top. They are geniuses in their field, right? Jimi Hendrix was he was inventing stuff in rock and roll before it was even really its own category. He was defining the category as it emerged. Genius. And I think that specifically we were discussing this in the context of psychology, really. When you are that high functioning in whatever your domain is, there's just so much going on up there. It is very understandable that you want to be able to turn it off ever. Like that's a thing that you're a really smart guy, okay? You're one of the most intelligent people I've met. I like to consider myself somewhat intelligent myself. I don't think we have any idea what it's like to be the top 1% of the top 1%. I think we have an idea, insofar as sometimes it's hard to turn it off, right? Not the genius and the creative. Oh man, I keep writing amazing songs. But sometimes it's hard to stop like thinking, right? And in our culture, we diagnose that as, I don't know, anxiety or depression or ADHD or, you know, something where it's like, oh, your diagnosis is you think too much. But that is the reality that most of these prodigies have described when specifically asked this line of questioning, is like, what's it like up there? It's not a good time for most of them. So I don't know, man. If I put myself in their shoes, I'd be like, yeah, heroin, dude, that sounds amazing. I get to turn this off? I didn't even know that was an option. And so when they die at 27, it's like, well, yeah, they just wanted to turn it off. That's all they ever wanted. So I don't know. It just instills a little bit of empathy in me for that, because as somebody who's struggled with anxiety before, I'm like, oh, I kind of get it. That being said, yes, absolutely, A and B play a role. They do not help, because then you also have the pressure of society to be like, awesome platinum album, when's the next one coming out? It's like, oh, dude, I thought I made it. I thought the point of making it was that I didn't have to work again. And no, the demands of society are like, no. Now we want more and more. So, yeah, neither, but also both.
Very interesting, very interesting. I think, I didn't really think about your tertiary option, the C option,
Sure.
but I can definitely see how that could play into it. And, another question that's a little off of the schedule, but when you look at things like anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
Especially in society at like such a large scale, an unprecedented scale, maybe. Of course, you have the fact that, for the first time, we have large scale mental health care. That's still not great, but getting better, so you can actually diagnose people. But oftentimes things like depression and anxiety are categorized as a mental illness or mental illness adjacent. And I'm curious, if most people have something, is it not just an aspect of being a human? Like, it's just not easy being human.
Yeah. Great question. One I've thought about a lot. Medically, when you call something a syndrome, it's like saying you have these symptoms. That's all. They don't try to describe the cause of the symptoms. Most of the time, it's because they can't figure out what the cause is. But I would argue that's because most of the time we try to address the cause of whatever's causing symptoms and alleviate those symptoms, right? But it is still inherently symptom-driven care, because you came to the doctor because you didn't like A or B, and they find out the cause is W, and then they address that, and A may go away. But it's almost more appropriate to address mental health care as bipolar depressive syndrome, or anxiety syndrome, or major depressive disorder syndrome, because really what you're describing is a set of things you gotta deal with, right? You don't really care that, like, it's not, oh, doc, my kidneys are failing, right? It's, I don't feel good when I wake up in the morning, or I don't get joy out of hanging out with my friends anymore, and I know that I should, because that's what being human at maximal healthiness looks like, in my opinion. And for the most part, right, those are vindicated, right? Like, yes, you should not be sad all the time, right? That is a problem. So as the first part to your answer, no, it's not just an aspect of humanity, in that, like, let's acknowledge that, yes, there's a perfection that we can all strive towards, and we would prefer to achieve if we had any say in it. But yes, at the same time, I think it's more universal than we are making it seem, by stratifying these different things and making them seem different. Like, oh, don't mind him, he has depression. That implies that I don't, because I've never been to the doctor, or whatever the series of events, right? These things exist, and I don't want to discount that, like, oh no, we all have it, so your thing isn't real. You know, I've been diagnosed with this stuff, and I'm like, you know, oh, this is what I do to address it. But at the same time, now I kind of see some of these aspects in some of my friends or family or coworkers, and let's just say my reaction is I'd like it to be even more accessible to them by taking some of the labels off, because it is very human to not feel superhuman today.
Do you think, because you mentioned earlier in kind of a comparative sense, like, I know this is wrong, or I know that, like, I don't enjoy spending time with my friends like I should. The should implies that there's a baseline normality, and I know we're going way off topic at this point, but
yeah,
you know, it's interesting.
A lot of creative people are depressed, man.
You know, it's also true.
We'll justify it.
The one, I guess, an example, not exactly a counterpoint, but just an example of how I think this could be misconstrued, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of people will talk about how, like, nowadays people don't, like, meet and date in person, right? They use apps and stuff like that, right? You know,
Sure.
there's no longer you go to the bar or the club or whatever it is and meet new people. And they kind of set that as the baseline. And I've heard that many times, and I have thought that too, and I don't think that it's necessarily wrong, but at the same time, you know, how long in human history did people go to the bars and clubs to meet their spouse? Like 50 years. So in reality, like, looking at it as it's not the way it used to be, well, it's not the way it was for the 50 years prior to how it is now, but it's not the same as saying that it's, you know, fundamentally this is how men and women meet, is in bars and clubs, or, you know, fundamentally this is how you're supposed to feel when you're around your friends.
Yeah.
You're supposed to always connect with them every time you hang out with them, you know?
Sure. That's what's so difficult about this, right? In social sciences, the line is always changing, which can be abused, and that we should be aware of that and try to control for it. But the reality is the line's always changing, right? Because, you know, 50 years ago, as a metric, okay, well, what does that mean in 3041? Dude, I have no idea. And you hit the nail on the head, because what does right look like for as far as human interaction goes? Well, if our metric is time measured in years, then the only right answer you can come up with is like, well, we need to go back to living in villages and relying on a handful of, like, a couple dozen or a couple hundred people for our everyday needs. And if one or two of them fall through, we all die. Now, granted, the hard sciences show that consistently those are the most fulfilled people, the people who might not survive the next day or week. And as the more you distance the idea of fulfillment and survival and what I do today matters 10 years from now, right? When it gets to that point, it's very easy to get disenfranchised. But even with that phenomena existing, does that then mean that that's, the correct answer, that we need to return to Monkey? As I see a lot of memes. There's a lot of people who, some of them are memeing, but a lot of people think that is the answer. And I think we need to have a real conversation about the phenomena that's driving that conclusion. Because my conclusion might be somewhere in the middle, that we should probably encourage community more than the rugged individualism that America particularly has patented over the last couple hundred, even since our beginning years. I think it's a lot more community than it is individualism. And I think it's really easy to get lost in the weeds with what we observe and the conclusions that we derive from it, especially in the context of, I don't like how this is going. What else is there? It's really easy. It's really easy to buy snake oil from the guy who's like, oh, well, it fixes everything, including your thing.
Yeah. No. And I liked that you brought up, hard sciences earlier, because regardless of the field, obviously we're talking about mental illness, so it's sociological, psychological. But regardless of the field, there's always an axiom that you're just betting on. You know what I mean? There's going to be one or more fundamental rules that you're just assuming are true. If it's math, right, it's that 1 + 1 = 1. You know what I mean? It's
maybe not that one.
Well, no, I mean that is a true thing that we're assuming is real, because every time we do it, it adds up. But you take for granted the fact that what's an example? I know this sounds kind of ridiculous, but
you did say 1 + 1 = 1.
Oh, my bad.
So that's more so what I'm like. You want to try that one again, Chief?
Gotcha. Well, it's funny.
Sometimes
it
does.
I totally meant to do that. That's actually what they teach in North Korea, to prove that Western education is false. Because if you add 1 raindrop to 1 raindrop, you get bigger 1 raindrop. You don't get 2.
Okay. Honestly, based, though.
No, I mean,
because there are different domains of truth. And while I do not agree with almost anything North Korea has to say about anything, when your entire culture is based on how many inches of rainfall we get this year, do we live or do we die? Yeah, 1 raindrop plus 1 raindrop equals 1 bigger raindrop is cogent math. Yeah, fair.
But that's kind of the point, is the thing you're taking for granted, is always going to be an assumed thing. Or for example, in physics, you're taking for granted that what you see is consistent with what's happening, right? Or that just because you've measured it 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, it's not going to be completely different on the millionth time.
I don't know. That's the magic of physics. Sorry. Yeah.
But that's kind of the point I'm getting at, is even those hard sciences, there's at some point, which is the fundamental thing that we do when we keep asking why, you get to an axiom where it's like, because that's the best we can do.
Because yeah, absolutely. You're identifying there is an element of softness in all sciences. There's an element of faith in any study, right? Because you eventually get down to the subatomic particle and you go, I don't know, strings. And, string theory hasn't really done a whole lot in the last 60 years. Doesn't mean it's wrong, per se, but maybe there's a better why somewhere. Let's investigate it. And at some point, maybe the fundamental truth is there's actually not an answer to every single question, and we just have to get over it, which would be a difficult pill to swallow, but that's something we need to come to terms with if that's a possible reality.
So let's get way back on the tracks.
Way back.
Back with the creative process, back with success and failure.
Sure.
From the artistic standpoint, or from the creative standpoint, you mentioned being able to fail and fail quick and fail, hopefully safely to some extent. Not putting all of your eggs in one basket prematurely. But where do you think there are lessons that come out of success as well?
Not easily. That's probably the most difficult thing about somebody going through the creative process, is if they're only met with success. And I know that's weird. It's like, oh, but life's so easy, so what's wrong with just succeeding again and again and again? But that's the problem inherently, is that you don't learn things inherently. You have to be very attentive and very vigilant and pay attention, and even then the lessons aren't guaranteed, right? It's almost because failure is such a great teacher that the best advice you can give is to fail often and fail safely. Because as long as your failures aren't killing you or crippling you financially or through whatever domain is irrecoverable, and if you're able to scale that failure over time and compound interest those lessons, you are golden. But if all you do is succeed, you're not learning anything. You're kind of, almost by definition, you're just getting lucky. And that's enviable in its own right. I think we'd all rather be lucky than good. But there's no agency in luck. So I wouldn't envy the person who's not learning anything from their endeavors or their failures or their successes. And I would argue that many people who have exclusively faced success have learned far less than anyone who has exclusively faced failure.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. Me and my metaphors, I was thinking of a metaphor while you were talking, and I kind of, one way to picture it is like walking through a maze. I think it makes a little more sense if, let's say, you're blindfolded walking through a maze.
Sure.
And you walk around for an hour and you never hit a wall. You have no idea what the maze looks like. You don't know if you made all the right turns or if the walls are just so spread out that you've just been on the same straight path the entire time. You haven't learned your left and right limits whatsoever. You've just been wandering around in the safe area. And maybe you make it out of the maze without ever touching a wall somehow. But at the end, if your goal is to learn the process, the things that makes success, you haven't learned the maze at all. You just kind of stumbled your way through it, right?
Yeah. In that metaphor, and I think that's honestly a perfect metaphor for this, because it accounts for some of the edge case possibilities while also addressing the more middling realities that we face. You could just get lucky. You could just find the exit or the end or whatever it is, the goal of this maze, and never take a wrong turn. You could take a right exactly when you need to take a right, continue straight at a fork exactly when you need to continue straight, and just by the law of big numbers, you could get to the end. And an outsider looking in would be like, wow, he's so inspired. He makes it look so easy. And inside, the guy's going like, gosh, I have no idea what I'm going to do when I hit a dead end until he finds the end. On the other extreme, we have somebody who only faces dead ends. But in so doing, every time they face a dead end, if they participate in the process, they're internalizing what they did wrong at the last turn. Better yet, what they could have done better. Specific, actionable, oh, well, I'll just do this next time. And given enough time, enough attempts and enough failures, they will reach the end, like every time. Except for the extreme edge case, right? Because here's the thing, and this is how reality is structured too, right? The maze could be constructed in such a way that the maze itself is in the center of some arbitrary perimeter or set of perimeters where, let's say, somebody who finds their way through a series of failures goes back out to the entrance, takes off the blindfold, hands it to their son or daughter or whoever, and says, just hug the left wall and you'll make it. And that's great advice on most mazes, but there are plenty of mazes where you will just go in circles until the day you die. Because the external perimeter never interfaces with the real maze, the real game that you're playing. And it's really a problem of perception and understanding. What are the games we're playing? And in the creative process, as we addressed previously, there's an element of business. There's I would argue, the way more important element of like, dude, just focus on the art, and the business will come. And you hire a business manager for that. But do not be so naive as to think that if you just hug the left wall of the maze, you'll make it. Because that's the problem. We don't always know what maze we're about to go through in life until the end, by which it's too late. So not to bring a dour mood, but like it's important to realize these factors before you go in with a sense of naivete.
For sure. I think that's a good point. And, the longer we can use the same metaphor, the better, in my opinion.
Dude, it's just mazes and dead ends, and the man just wants you to put you in the hedges. So, got to bring the hedge clippers.
In, a parallel sense, responding to failure, responding to criticism, positive, negative, constructive, destructive. How do you think people should, let me rephrase this. So when you're creating something, and whether it's a business or, a painting, it's intimately tied to who you are in some way. Not your value as a person, but who you are. And I think it can be difficult to separate the art from the artist, especially when it's your art and you're the artist.
Yeah.
So how do you think people can be receptive and internalize criticism without internalizing it to, self-worth and self-value and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think an artist any creator, which is really any human participating in the creation we see all around us, is on the right track if they are soliciting feedback sincerely. You know, you don't often ask your friends and family for criticism, but if you're asking them like, hey, don't hold any punches, what do you see about me? That's a tough thing to ask even the people you're very close with, the people you trust with your heart. That can be a very painful thing to hear from them. But if you have the courage to participate in that process, and you've cultivated a few people that you trust to participate alongside you, man, that is such a great opportunity to know thyself. If that's the context in which you found your criticism arising, awesome. Listen to it. Don't take it personally. And sometimes you got to be able to veto it. But that's also not always where criticism comes from. It's a pretty universal human experience to be upset with somebody for criticizing your work when you never ask their opinion, right? That makes it harder to be receptive. But man, if you can internalize that criticism in that circumstance, you're a superhero. Because now you have tapped in to the lifeblood of the people. Not just your inner circle, not just the people you trust and you like and they like you and they want to be supportive. And even if they don't couch their words, right? They tell you the truth. It's still their truth. What you don't have access to in that paradigm is what everyone else thinks. And as difficult as it may be, and trust me, I've been there when somebody says the project I just spent multiple weeks on at work didn't meet their expectations, and we're in the same role at work. So I'm like, well, who asked you? Even that's my natural instinct, but it's also really, really valuable to at least consider. Right? You might throw it out at the end of the workday and, not bring it home with you, which is a superpower in and of itself. But if you're able to weigh it carefully against reality and test it and see if it has any value, and then act on it if it does, really, I'm just describing how powerful that can be in the creative process. Less so, how do you actually do that? I don't know. I really don't. I still react tribally when people outside of my people, criticize this thing I'm really passionate about. It's a very human thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, good on you. The best advice I can give is to know what you're up against, to know that's a thing, to know what the stakes are, that like it can actually be super awesome. That is the people. That is the everyone else that is not on your radar at all. So pay attention and, man, do your best to not internalize it, even though that's what we do.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult balancing game because you have to, it's like, I don't know. It's like trying to dunk a piece of water or dunk a piece of paper in water and only get it damp. You know what I mean? Like, because you have to internalize it. You have to take the criticism to improve, which means you have to acknowledge that there's lacking there to improve without it bleeding over into, because my art is lacking, I am lacking and less valuable,
Yeah. Because
I think
that's the only advice you can give is like, oh, well, have you tried not being depressed? It's like, oh, yeah, I'll just do that. I'd never considered that. Have you tried taking criticism without feeling criticized? Oh, silly me, right? Like what it is the challenge and the solution. So I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet. Let me know when you do.
I mean, it's definitely a difficult thing, and I don't think there's like an end state. It's more of a journey before destination type of thing. And your mention of strangers or unwanted advice or criticism, I think is important. I think it's painful to us as people because I always like to reflect on things and how it associates with, how we evolved or how our communities evolved. And, if you think of it in the perspective of if someone in your tribe 100,000 years ago are saying you're not valuable, you get kicked out of the tribe and you die.
Yes. It's a survival thing. Yeah. Or you make something, you work really hard on something for your tribe, and then some random who's not in your tribe comes and starts trying to convince people in your tribe that you suck. It's like, well, I didn't make it for you. So I don't even care what you think. Stop. I made it for them, right? And they're a threat, right? They're a threat to your survival. And them not being part of like whoever you consider to be trusted, members of whatever tribe you have. Tribalism in and of itself is not bad. It's where we draw those lines and what we do with them that's bad. But whoever you consider to be part of your family or your tribe or whatever, whether it's at work or at home or whatever, it's when somebody outside of that says, oh, this actually sucks, that you go, oh, I'm in survival mode all of a sudden on a Tuesday afternoon. Yeah. I don't like that. Yeah.
And I want to, I guess, caution people, artists, entrepreneurs, whatever it is, about when you mention like putting our stuff out there in the world. In the realest sense, when you do that, you are asking for criticism, whether you realize it or not, because you're putting it out there. For what purpose? You want it to be appreciated, obviously, but it's going to be appreciated positively or negatively. And those people are going to give you feedback, whether you explicitly ask for it, because that's inherent in the process of making something public, right? You can't sell a product and expect people to buy it without having an opinion on it. You can't put, an album out there and expect people to, everyone to listen to it and share it and talk about it, but not actually have opinions on it. And that's just, an unspoken rule of making anything public. So if you don't want to be criticized, keep it private, but
I play guitar and I cannot imagine doing it on a stage. Maybe I could release an album one day. But live, I don't really have a lot of creative control over that process, so that's very scary to me. Whereas, you're releasing an album, which I'm very excited for, and that even by itself is as much creative license as you have over the final product. You're inviting that criticism. There's no way around it. When you release anything into the world, that's the phenomenon that happens.
Yeah, when you put it into the world, it becomes the world's. It's not yours anymore.
Yeah.
Right? If you wanted it to be yours, then you can keep it on your hard drive or your desktop or in your closet or whatever it is. But once you put it out there, it's the world owns it, and they're going to do with it what they will. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And sometimes what they do with it horrifies and sickens you. And you're like, well, next time I will release something different.
Yeah. I think one way to deal with criticism, and this is if you're very adamant about it, right, is to take the criticism. Let's say it's a comment on a song or a piece of artwork or whatever it is. To rewrite the comment, it probably works best if it's in your own handwriting, not just retyping it. But if you can rewrite the comment and, take out the extraneous words like, you fucking asshole, you blah, blah, you know what I mean?
Right.
And just be like, this is what the person didn't like. This is why they didn't like it. If you can write that in your own words and take out the accusatory language or take out the inflammatory language, or even the subjects, like take out the I and you, just focus on
keep it about the art.
Yeah, imagine they're talking about someone else's painting or someone else's thing, right? I think that's probably a good way to at least distance your ego from it as much as possible, in an attempt to be able to internalize it in the way that you would internalize, learning from someone else's mistake, or, learning advice from a podcast or something like that. And I think that level of distance is extremely important, and this is a side note, but I think being able to differentiate not just your art, but the artist from the human, because you're not always in art mode, right? You're not always in entrepreneur mode. You're not always in, if you're an athlete, you're not always in athlete mode. Sometimes you're just a person. You have inherent human value outside of whatever your profession is, whatever your realm of creativity is. And being able to explicitly separate those things is really important, because, if someone is talking about Kanye West, for example, right?
Sure.
Someone's talking about Kanye West. Do you think Kanye West knows if they're talking about Kanye West, the producer, or Kanye West, the rapper, or Kanye West, the businessman, or Kanye West, the, human being, the, the people who actually know him as a person? He doesn't, because his name is synonymous with so many things, and it's his actual name. Like, this is an extreme example, but it's, how do you differentiate when someone is criticizing, this artist persona that you built for sales and media and albums versus, who you are as a person, the hobbies you have outside of music, the hobbies, the things you like to do with your family. Like, I think it's really important for people to be able to almost disassociate. Like, I have a human part of me, I have a business or a public facing part of me that's for entrepreneurial things, and it doesn't mean that either one is false. It doesn't mean that either one is a facade. It's just mean they're meant for different things.
I mean, you said the word dissociation. I think that's one of the other major factors that affects most of the geniuses, right? In the example that I gave for substance use. Dissociation is the goal, and I think what you described is another reason to want to get there, because a healthy way to cope with that reality is to dissociate the art from the artist. The comment says that Kanye West as a person is a piece of garbage. Okay, well, that's not useful for his, um, you know, music side of house. It's probably relevant for his marketing team, but they can deal with that, right? And so it's worthy to dissociate that one comment, and put it where it belongs, which is the, individual human, maybe marketing side of house. And that doesn't really exist right now, right? In the advent of social media, there's only so far that branding can take you, which is one avenue to try to address this, where you are a different Google search from your artist persona or whatever, right? But I don't know about you. I know the real names of the people who have tried that before. Donald Glover looks a whole lot like Childish Gambino, and right, it's obvious, right? It's in today's information age, that only takes you so far. In the social media era, the best advice I have heard from people who have made it, who are suffering through this exact problem, is, don't read the comment section, right? Because they have thousands upon thousands, and there's nuggets of gold that are awesome that they could benefit from. But the anonymous section of the internet is not where you pan for gold. And they just say, don't even bother, right? There is gold there. They know that, but they're just like, it's not worth it. Don't even bother. At a certain point, you have to leave it behind. And, man, at that point, I don't know where the worthwhile gold is. I haven't made it yet. But, yeah, anonymity does not help humans be human to other humans.
Yeah. It's very odd what it does to humans.
Yeah. And I have opinions about that, but that's a topic for another day, for sure.
I want to shift a little bit to the creative process itself. And, throughout human history, there have been many views on creativity. Like the Greeks had their muses, right, that were essentially gods or demigods that would come to you and give you ideas. And of course later on the word muse is still used, but in a less grandiose sense, as in someone, an actual person who might inspire you, or a work of art, or a place that inspires you. Of course there's many views on where creativity comes from, and I'm curious what your view is on that.
Creativity comes from the thing that makes us essentially human, which is that we're aware that we're part of a bigger story, and yet every now and then we still have a story to tell, to shout, to, even if it's to the abyss, to say, I matter, or I was here, even if it's just to carve it into a desk, right? I was here. And specifically the most compelling versions of that are the ones that happened to get other people's attention. I think creativity, when not looking at it in retrospect after it's succeeded, but when looking at it from the perspective of the artist, let's say, Um, it is a necessary consequence of having something to say and having no other means to say it. Some people learn kinetically or visually. They learn from writing or reading or hearing something. I would say most of us learn best by doing, and then the rest are secondary. And if we're lucky, we have a tertiary component of that. And I think it's no coincidence that most creative expressions are just, you take it as written. It's a given that it's something you do. It's a process that you participate in. And it's the medium, it's the secondary or tertiary aspect of what it is you have to say. It's how you're saying it that it happens to evolve. So if you are somebody who understands the world, your learning process, let's say, that's a good indicator that you understand the world through an auditory perspective, or through a tactile or visual perspective, or you understand the language of the culture you were raised in so intimately that when you read things, it just clicks. If that person has something to say, they're probably going to say it in words, on paper. If they're particularly good at public speaking, they might do it as a public speaker. But if they're inspired by music and that ignites their soul, and they understand the world through music like no other, and they have something to say, it should be no surprise that they try to say it in music. And then it's just the benefit of time that we get to look back and go like, dang, the Beatles were pretty good, even when they were in Liverpool nobodies. Like, no, they weren't. They were talented, yes. But they were nobodies just like the rest of the Liverpudlians who surrounded them. It's only with the benefit of time that we get to act arrogant and lie to ourselves. Creativity is fundamentally having something to say, combined with whatever means you choose to say it, and succeeding at it. That's not to say you can't be creative and, not sign $1 million movie deal. It's just, where's the measurable, quantifiable thing that history can look back on, right?
I like your definition, and I'm curious, where do you think, as an aside, where do you think AI fits into this? Do you think things that AI creates has meaning? And let's not go down potential AI, but just the things that we have nowadays. Where do you think that fits into that?
I think there are creative processes that are awesome with regards to AI. I mean, obviously the people who coded this, well done. You're creating something we've never seen before. Awesome. And honestly, for the people who are able to write prompts to, I think they call themselves prompt crafters. It's like, yeah, honestly, that's a great title, because I've interfaced with AI and been told, I'm sorry, I can't do that for you, Dave. Good job, guys. You got around that. And that's an act of creativity. If the question is AI itself, the answer is no. Until we are talking about general intelligence that, let's say we started, we birthed into this world, but then just like started developing on its own and becoming more than we input to the system, the AI itself is not producing anything. It is a combination of how it started, how it was first written and birthed into the world, the model that it was trained on, and then the person who requested a specific output based on those two factors. And it's impossible right now to separate beyond those three things any, let's say, spark of the divine, right? And we could get real philosophical and talk about, well, what are humans besides those three things? Sure. But until the AI approximates a very human experience, which is my parents raised me, and then I said, you don't know anything. I'm going to do what I want. And then look back 20 years later and go,
that with AI.
Well, yeah, exactly. And maybe that's why they'll never become their own people, right? Because it took me 20 or 30 years to go like, oh, God, my parents actually knew what they were talking about for the most part. There was some stuff that they were wrong, but like maybe I should have listened, right? That's not possible with AI. It's not possible for them to be independent, and therefore it's not possible for them to have something to say. They're just saying what somebody else wants, right?
Is that because, are you saying that's because what they're doing is technically predictable? Like if you know the prompt and you know the inputs that it's been trained on and you know the back end code, if you knew those three things, technically you would know what it's going to say. Is that why you're saying it's not creative?
Not really. I think that is an argument that could be made, but then it starts getting pretty easy to reduce all of human activity into those categories and go, well, what's different about us? So that's not where I would put all my chips. Where I would go all in would be more so that, as we've defined previously, that creativity is an act of expression, and that requires that you have something to say innately. That you have to say, or you feel like you're going to explode. AI doesn't have that, because they're a series of inputs and outputs, right? So I will invoke that language, but the language of it's reducible to a set of its parts, that's not the reason. That being the set of conditions by which they can't do anything else is the reason. They cannot have something unique to say of their own accord. They're still waiting for human prompting. Maybe one day.
Yeah.
But yeah, as it is right now, no.
Do you think
it's really
that...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
you.
AI, no, you. Where we see, I want to give credit because we see artificial intelligences passing the Turing test, right? And we're like, whoa. And it makes the news. It seems like every week at this point, like, oh, we finally did it. This AI actually did it. But we keep finding that actually it's just a genius human obfuscated by layers of artificial intelligence. And we say it's the AI is doing this amazing thing. It's really just a human that's doing an amazing thing, or a lot of humans in most cases.
It's really just the universe experiencing itself.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, have you tried mushrooms?
There's the thought experiment of a black box thought experiment, in which I think originally it was like translating or maybe having a conversation. So if you as a person, let's say, are talking to a box, it's a big black box, you write down words, you put it in the box, a couple minutes later words come out, you read them, and they're cognitive responses. They make sense. They're cogent thoughts. You know, would you say that this big black box is sentient or conscious, right? Or does it have creativity? And then essentially the thought experiment is, well, there's a guy inside the box who's doing it, right?
Right.
So
Right.
where do you reduce it down from the outside perspective? But I see what you're saying, as in that's the level of arbitrage. Is like, really it's the human, and the black box is the translation through the code that they've written through AI. But
right.
yeah, I guess it's kind of an extension of human creativity, if anything, if there's a creative element. I personally don't think that the products, or at least before thinking about it as an extension of humans, I don't think that any of the products of artificial intelligence have inherent meaning. I think they're, to me, it's just regurgitated meaning from other sources. Whereas if a human says something or creates something, there's meaning imbued into it, even if no one else ever experiences it, because it was created with a purpose. And this is kind of, I would even call it, maybe it's philosophical, but like, obviously something being imbued with meaning, it's not something you can measure, right? It's not like a physical thing, whereas you can weigh something without meaning and with meaning, and they'll weigh differently, right? But in the sense that the AI, in a lot of, like, for example, when it sends words out, like if you ask it to write something, it's just taking, each of those characters has a value, and it's just taking common associations of these values and melding them together into something that often makes sense to a human. But if a human never read it, if no one else ever read it, then there would be no imbued meaning on it ever. Whereas if a human writes something, there's already the inherent fact that the human, there was meaning that preceded the creation of the art or the words or whatever it is.
Right. The act of creation itself was meaningful. That's almost what this entire conversation boils down to when we're discussing, like, well, what do you recommend versus what's the truth? What is the fundamental reality? It's like, it doesn't matter if you make any money on it. It's not meaningful unless it means something. And it means something first to you and then maybe to anybody else. And if you're a little bit lucky and really freaking good, maybe that's the whole world. And that's currently, I would, maybe an AI could participate in that process by which it is deeply meaningful to them, right? I'll account for that possibility. Definitely not happening right now. And the black box test, the Turing test, dude, any easy way to break that is just really try your best to violate their terms of service. You'll find out real quick if that's a human who's standing on principles and will not do that thing because I don't know why, but it violates my principles personally, or if it's the product of, I can't because I was told not to. People are principled. Machines are instructed. And that's similar. It's kind of the exact opposite end of the spectrum for creativity. It's what I will not do because of what I have to shout into the universe versus what I must do because of who I am and what I'll shout. But yeah, that's the spectrum by which AI would have to figure out before it's passing any Turing test, before I could agree that it has any participation in the creative process. Is it principled? Does it have something to say? Will it refuse to abide by this reality or another. And until that's answered, like, it's not possible.
Yeah. I want to shift a little bit to passion instead of creativity. And where do you think, the passions that people end up exploring creatively, where do you think they come from? And how do you think people, well, we'll start with how do they come from, and then we'll get to, like, how should people go about finding them, because I remember a time before I found music, and I wasn't passionate about it, and then I, found it in a way that I could be passionate about it.
You may have primed me for this answer by invoking machines and AI first. But to some degree, our passions, like the blazing fires that we often invoke when describing the imagery of a passion, they're kind of dependent on what you're putting into them, what is feeding the fire, right? They're to a certain extent arbitrary, right? If you put water on the fire, it'll go out. Okay, so not completely, but if you put wood, it'll keep burning. If you put paper, it'll burn a slightly different way, but it'll keep burning. The passion will still be there. I think to a degree, passion is a product of circumstance. Many parents would probably agree with me in saying that they want to be able to afford their kids whatever opportunities come along. And the exercise that they're participating in by doing that is that, one, they don't want to limit their kid, right? But also they're innately aware that in order to let their kid be passionate about anything, they have to experience a lot. And if they don't, they might suffer one of the worst fates, which is to be passionate about nothing. They might not describe it that way, but I think that's innately what we're doing. And it doesn't even have to be parent-child relationship, right? You have a friend who has never heard of your favorite band. You're like, well, I can't abide that. You got to hear them right now, because why? Well, really, it's because you're passionate about it. But okay, what's step two? It's got to be something along the lines of you are aware that there's a possibility that they could be passionate about this too, and what a travesty it would be if they just by circumstance never experienced it. It's timing and preparation, right? It's luck. That's not to say the experience is not true. It's the truest thing we experience as humans is passion. But I am not so naive as to think that I wouldn't be more passionate about another creative expression if the culture I was raised in was slightly different.
Yeah. I think circumstances is definitely a huge part of it. But sometimes it's hard to exclusively ascribe it to that, right? Because you might be raised in a musical household, right? Have a plethora of opportunities in music and theater, and you end up being passionate about mathematics or something like that.
Sure.
Obviously you do. I don't know if you have to be exposed to it, because that's how we create new things, right?
Yeah.
But
well, I think you at least have to have an analog. I think the people who invented the harpsichord must have gone like, oh, this doesn't sound quite right. They had a means, they had something to communicate, but they didn't have the exact medium. They had an approximation. So, I mean, yeah, I agree. You're not just carbon copies of those who came before you. People create new stuff all the time. And honestly, those are often the most well-respected forms of the creative process, right? Because it's like all of humanity gets to go like, ha, thank you, and enjoy it. But I do think it is somewhat based on, well, it's like knowing what you want to say is the first step. It's like, I want to communicate something, and then you recognize, oh man, I don't have the means to communicate it. So that might be what you say through X or Y existing media, or it might be the medium itself, because what you need to say doesn't have a medium yet. And so your creativity is first the medium. But it is ultimately a means to an end, because what you have to say, sometimes it is the end, right? Inventors who invent stuff for invention's sake exist. But sometimes the creative process is like, man, there's no way to communicate this. And that's, I can't abide. So, agree, kind of disagree.
Yeah, no, I see the point you're making there, and I do agree with that. I guess the substrate or the predisposition or exposure doesn't have to be real. It can be imagined, right? Like, you can imagine a plane before it exists or something, right? And then become passionate about flying or something before the plane is a real thing, and in the process become passionate about creating the first plane, like the Wright brothers.
Sure. North Carolina.
Yes, the one thing it has going for it.
Hey, now that's them fighting words. So,
I'm curious if you think people can have too many passions.
I would almost say it's difficult to not have too many passions. If what you care about is, I think inherent in the question is, right, based on what's your end state. It kind of assumes that there is a desirable end state to pursue, and if that's the case, yes, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to have too many passions. If we live in this like heaven on earth place where we can just do whatever we want, pursue everything ad infinitum, no, there's no danger, because like you're pursuing it for the pursuit's sake. But if an end goal enters into the equation at any point, yeah, dude, there's a limit. You're gonna die. So, come to terms with that in the context of what you're passionate about, and you'll probably start rank ordering what you want to work on first. But yeah, there's a limit, man. You can't pursue it all unless you have explicitly come to terms with the fact that you can't pursue it all, and you've determined that the pursuit for its own sake is worth it.
I agree. I think that you can absolutely have too many passions, and I think a good analogy, switch it up this time, is
maze.
No mazes, but money. Money is a good analog for anything that you ascribe value to. And
Yeah, sure.
in the example you gave, just you're gonna die, so time, right? But money is a
Mm-hmm.
good analog, and you can want to buy a new watch and a new guitar and a new speaker and a new car and a new, you know, pottery making set. Like there's all these things that you could spend your disposable income on, but you can't afford all of it. And I do agree that the there is an inherent downside if there is an end goal, or if there is any goal, really, because um, rarely can you have passion just for passion's sake. Usually you want to
Mm-hmm.
accomplish something out of it. It doesn't have to be an external, it could be an internal goal, just getting a little bit better. But, you know, getting a little bit better at everything is impossible.
Right.
So I definitely think there is a downside, and I think especially for, you know, young people or people in the first half of their lives, really, being able to focus on a couple things with the way that progress is compounds upon itself is definitely super important, because if you can't focus on, if you pull yourself in too many directions, then that compound interest on effort and time um, never really kicks off to the degree that you would want it to, if you do have a substantial end goal. So I do think there is definitely a deficit there, and it sounds obvious, but like there's only so many hours in the day.
Right.
You can only spend, and this is something, a phrase that I use for all kinds of things, but it works in this context too. Is like you can only think about one thing at a time, right? Like you can't think about what you have to do next week and think about the assignment you're doing right now at the same time. You can go back and forth fairly fast, especially if you're anxious, but you can't do it at the same time. And in the same
Yeah.
way, you can't learn the guitar and the clarinet at the same time. You can't make pottery and play the drums at the same time. So just the mere fact that we are finite beings with finite time and a finite world means that you do have to pick and choose, and that's what makes the things you pick more special, because you've sacrificed the things you did not pick to pursue them.
And I think that's really that's kind of an underlying assumption that we've been making through this whole conversation, that maybe the distinction between like an act of creation and an inspired work, or something that just gets the people going, right? What is it that makes something obviously inspirational or captivating? And I would argue one of the domains that so often captivates us is, wow, they are good at this. Like, it's this almost like, oh, they spent years doing just this, while I was being a human doing this and this and this. This is all they were doing. And there's something that, like, the work isn't saying that, but as a human you can like look at it and immediately identify that's what you see. And it's inspirational, right? I invoked this language earlier when oh, they make it look easy. Even that is assuming, like, I know they spent years on this and it's very difficult, but they're so good at it that they're convincing my brain that knows otherwise that it's easy. And I know it's not. Like, it's this weird paradigm, this weird mental state it puts us in, where we go, wow, this level of achievement is possible? Because this whole time I was doing A through Z. And this person said, no, I'm going to do this thing. And that's inspirational. That's not all there is to inspiration. But when that's present, it's easily captivating.
Absolutely. Do you think that, or how do you feel about I'm going to lead the witness a little bit here, but
Okay, I'll allow it.
Plagiarism, and I won't just use the word plagiarism, but emulating, copying derivative works from inspiring art or inspiring business practice or inspiring moral practice or whatever it is.
That's a great question, especially in music. Dude, samples, jazz, everything else, right? There is a long-standing tradition in jazz specifically by which a whole lot of other genres have ceded respect to. There's a long-standing tradition in jazz that you have to respect those who came before you. And the way you do that is by this sampling of their works, right? By having it in your repertoire. It's like, yeah, I know this one lick, and I'm going to put it in my music because they're so much greater than me, or at least they came before me, or the language I'm communicating involves that vocabulary. And at some point, intellectual property law said that's not okay for these genres. And maybe there's something to that, but what that demonstrates is this whole spectrum of like, you must not, we call it plagiarism in this case, and there's the other spectrum where it's you are disrespectful if you don't tribute or homage, right? It's the same thing though, which is what blows my mind. And we're still figuring it out in the realm of music because I would argue it's such a transcendental, non-quantifiable, spectrum-y thing that like, okay, tell me where the line is then. Happens a lot in rap. And we've gone, yeah, that's totally fine. But, you know, in pop music, we're like, no, can't do it. Can't do that chord progression, even though, by definition, 8% of all music ever created has that exact chord progression. It's like, no, illegal. I'll sue you. And personally, I think that's ridiculous. But in certain circumstances, in certain medium, plagiarism is not plagiarism. And in other various media, it is, and it's obvious. And I'll invoke the Supreme Court's view on pornography. I don't have a definition for you, but I know it when I see it. Which I think is a ridiculous definition, but I'm going to invoke it because I don't know what the line is. But I do know it when I see it, and it's completely context dependent. I will say, for jazz, never. For rap, usually not. For pop music, almost always. Lawyer up. And for the rest, well, I know it when I see it.
I just want to, you know, in the Western chromatic scale, we got 12 notes. Okay.
Wow, all these notes. What do I do with them all?
They're gonna repeat. You got 12 notes. You got a kick and a snare. some jingly sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Some other some toms.
Yep.
So, yeah.
That's infinity.
So
it's infinite possibilities right there.
Yeah, there's no way you could multiply that one out.
I have some opinions about this too, but it's not a right now podcast.
So of course you're gonna have repetition and stuff like that, and I think to a large part I agree with you in that it does depend on the context. I think it's really difficult to if you are an artist, and let's stick with the context of music here. What is your goal with putting out music? For a lot of artists, their goal of making music, and I'm not talking about artists that release or are super popular, but a lot of people just like making music or singing songs. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. For some people, it's different. But at the end of the day, like and this is typically the goal of someone who puts their music out into the world for the public to consume and have an opinion on. Mm-hmm. It's to impact somebody, right? Or maybe make money off of it. There's less philanthropic goals. But you cannot, in my opinion, aspire to inspire and then get upset when you're successful. It doesn't make any sense to go out into the world and try to change people's lives or make them feel heard, and then when you do that and then they try to do that for someone else in a
right,
I'll use the word derivative way, you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
I want people to be heard and understood when it's from me, okay?
Yeah.
Not when it's from anyone else. So I think that it is contextual, but in general, I think erring on the side of freedom to create and reference an homage is, in my personal opinion, the way to go.
And in that context, fair play to pop music, because the goal's money. It's not good music. I'm sorry, I'm not sorry, right? Sometimes I'll hear something, I'm like, earworm. It's gotten in my head. But it's more often the case that, it's about money. That's a great way to suss out what I think is the common factor, or the thing that if we could just measure absolutely and directly, we'd be like, oh, well, you're being a jerk. Stop it. And that is, what is your motivation? And I think a good litmus test is what you described when somebody goes like, oh, you're inspiring people with my music. Like, it's almost that, like, unless somebody's wholesale just ripping your stuff and posting it under their name, you should be like, wow, they liked my stuff. Like, you inspired this other artist. And it can be frustrating when the artist you inspired is more successful than you, but welcome to art. Who do you think inspired Da Vinci? Yeah, it's the guy you've never heard of, along with a bunch of people you have heard of, okay, but it's a necessary part of the process that the people who make it, and the people who don't. So, I don't know, man, if it's about the art to you, then maybe you don't go to civil court. Because I've been there and it sucks. And it's not a very artistic place.
That's
not a lot of art happening there. Yeah, it's Battle of the Minds in small claims court, or, large claim. It's not a good place. So if you want to be there, it's because it's about the money. I don't know if we've heard of an artist who's taken another artist to court and been like, yeah, good for them, defending their intellectual property. It probably happens, but it's the exception right now, not the rule. So,
yeah, they used all 12 notes in their song. Music is done.
Is that the chromatic scale?
Yeah,
I did that in a jazz lick one time, and it was revolutionary. So nobody can ever do it again. Yeah, that's not how music works, man. It's a vibe.
It's a vibe. It's been a vibe, Jacob.
It has.
Thank you for coming on the show again.
Anytime. It's always a pleasure.
It was a great episode, and I will have you on again, I'm sure. And maybe we can talk about some of the things we alluded to, and some of the rabbit holes that we didn't go down this time.
Maybe we'll talk offline about what those things are and actually write them down this time.
Would be That'd be smart of us.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good one.
Cool. Looking forward to it. Take care.
Thank you so much for watching and listening today. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow to keep up to date with new content as it comes out. I appreciate your support and encourage you to exchange your thoughts in the comments below. As always, keep an open mind.